What happens when truth enters a city already full of strong opinions and traditions? What kind of courage does it take to speak about faith when you know opposition is coming? And what if just a few people believing could shake an entire community? The road to Thessalonica was not just another stop on a journey. It was a turning point, a place where bold faith met intense resistance. Paul and Silas arrived there after traveling through Amphipolis and Apollonia, carrying with them not wealth, not power, but a message, simple yet powerful enough to transform lives. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue. It was familiar ground, a place where people already believed in God, already studied the scriptures, already waited for something more. For 3 Sabbaths, he reasoned with them. He didn't shout, he didn't force, he explained. He opened the scriptures and showed them something many had missed, that the Messiah had to suffer, that the Messiah had to rise from the dead, and then he made it personal. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just clarity, and something began to happen. Some of the Jews were persuaded, not all but some, and that mattered. Alongside them were many God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. People from different backgrounds, different stories, drawn together by the same truth. Faith doesn't always start with a crowd. Sometimes it begins quietly, in the hearts of a few who are willing to listen. But not everyone was willing. There were others watching, listening, not with open hearts, but with guarded minds. Jealousy began to grow, not because of lies, but because of the impact of truth. The message Paul and Silas brought was reaching people, changing people. And that kind of influence made some uncomfortable, so they acted. They gathered some troublemakers from the marketplace, not scholars, not leaders, just men willing to stir chaos. A mob formed. The city began to feel the tension. What started as a conversation in a synagogue was now spilling into the streets. They rushed to the house of Jason, where Paul and Silas were staying. They wanted to bring them out to the crowd. But Paul and Silas were not there. So instead they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials. And the accusation they shouted was powerful, even if they didn't fully understand it. These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here. Think about that for a moment. They didn't say these men were kind, or wise, or peaceful. They said they were turning the world upside down. Because that's what the message of Jesus does. It challenges what people think is stable. It confronts what people think is normal. It calls for a different way of living, a different king. And that's exactly what they accuse them of next. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, Jesus. That statement hit at the heart of the Roman world. Loyalty to Caesar was not just political. It was expected, enforced, and watched carefully. To suggest another king was dangerous. But Paul and Silas were not leading a rebellion with swords. They were proclaiming a kingdom not built by human hands. A king whose authority didn't come from armies, but from truth and sacrifice. Still, the crowd was stirred. The officials were troubled. Jason and the others had to post bond. A price had to be paid for the association, for the risk, for the disruption. Faith in that moment had a cost. Jason didn't stand there because it was easy. He stood there because he believed. He welcomed Paul and Silas into his home, knowing it might bring trouble. And when that trouble came, he didn't run. Sometimes following God doesn't look like standing on a stage. Sometimes it looks like standing in a courtroom, misunderstood, accused, and still choosing to stay faithful. The story in Thessalonica is not just about preaching, it's about response. Some listened and believed. Some resisted and reacted. And in between, there were those like Jason, supporting, risking, quietly holding the line. It raises a question that still matters today. How do we respond when truth challenges us? Because the message Paul shared wasn't comfortable. It required people to rethink everything. Their expectations of the Messiah, their understanding of suffering, their idea of power. A suffering Messiah? That didn't fit their expectations. A risen Savior? That demanded belief beyond logic. And a king named Jesus? That required surrender. It still does. The message hasn't changed, but the reactions often look the same. There are still those who listen, reflect, and believe. There are still those who feel threatened, who push back, who reject. And there are still those who quietly support, who open their homes, their hearts, their lives, even when it costs them something. The tension in Thessalonica reminds us that faith is not always welcomed. Truth is not always celebrated. And doing what is right does not always lead to comfort, but it always leads to purpose. Paul and Silas didn't measure success by the absence of opposition. They measured it by obedience. They spoke what they knew to be true, and they trusted God with the outcome. 3 Sabbaths. That's all it took to plant seeds that would last far beyond their stay. And even though they faced resistance, even though a mob formed, even though accusations were thrown, the message didn't stop. It never does, because truth has a way of moving forward even when people try to silence it. The believers in Thessalonica didn't have an easy start. Their faith was born in the middle of conflict, but sometimes the strongest faith grows in the hardest soil. When belief costs something, it becomes deeper. When standing for truth brings pressure, it becomes stronger. And when everything around you feels unstable, that's when you realize what you're standing on. The message of Jesus is not just information, it's transformation. It changes how we see suffering, not as defeat, but as part of a greater story. It changes how we see power, not as control, but as sacrifice. It changes how we see kingship, not as dominance, but as love. That's why it stirred the city, and that's why it still stirs hearts today. Maybe you've felt that tension before, that moment when something inside you says, this is true, but you know accepting it might change everything. Maybe you've seen how faith can divide opinions, challenge norms, and even bring conflict into places you expected peace. But the story of Thessalonica reminds us this is not new, and you are not alone in it. There have always been those who chose to believe, even when it was difficult. There have always been those who stood firm, even when others pushed back. And there has always been a message strong enough to endure it all. Paul and Silas didn't stay in Thessalonica forever. Their journey continued. But what they left behind was not temporary. Lives were changed, a community of believers was formed, and a testimony was written, not just in words, but in actions, in courage, in faith under pressure. Sometimes we think impact requires a long time, a large platform, or perfect conditions. But this story shows something different. 3 Sabbaths, a few conversations, a handful of people who believed, and a ripple effect that would continue long after they were gone. You don't need perfect circumstances to live out your faith. You don't need everyone to agree with you to stand for truth. And you don't need a crowd to make a difference. Sometimes it starts with one conversation, one act of courage, one decision to believe. The city of Thessalonica didn't stay the same after Paul and Silas passed through. Not because of noise, but because of truth. Not because of force, but because of faith. And that same truth is still moving today, still reaching people, still transforming lives, still calling for a response. So the question remains, how will you respond? Will you be among those who listen and believe? Will you stand firm even when it's not easy? Will you support, encourage, and hold on to faith even when it costs something? Because the story isn't just about them. It's about us. It's about what happens when truth meets our lives and what we choose to do next. Thank you for watching this video. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to like, follow the channel, and share this video with someone who needs encouragement today.